Morgan County, Alabama, is a large mass of land which stretches from the area northeast of Bankhead National Forest all the way up to the Tennessee River, just southwest of the city of Huntsville. It is just shy of being 600 square miles, most of which is made up of woods and small interconnected towns. The largest city in Morgan County, where most of this episode will take place, is Decatur. Decatur, also known as the River City, is coincidentally the county seat of Morgan County. Other towns in the area include Hartselle and Falkville, the latter of which is another area we'll visit over the span of this story. Throughout the 1960s, Morgan County was receiving a large influx of people. Decatur was coming into its own as one of the largest port cities along the Tennessee River, and a military base was bringing in scores of military contractors, scientists, and their families. This military base, named Redstone Arsenal, had originally been created during World War II. It started out as a missile ordnance storage facility just outside of Huntsville, Alabama, a large city just northeast of Morgan County. But the base continued to evolve as that conflict came to an end. After World War II, the Army's rocket research and development activities were transferred from Fort Bliss to here in northern Alabama. This included many German scientists that were included in Operation Paperclip, which is another interesting story in its own right. Throughout the 1950s, Redstone Arsenal continued to expand its mission, especially once the space race officially commenced. President Dwight D. Eisenhower responded to the emerging Cold War by creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, also known as NASA. He then transferred all U.S. Army space-related activities at Redstone Arsenal to the civilian-led NASA, and the area began to grow pretty rapidly. The Army Missile Command launched at Redstone Arsenal in August of 1962, and over the next 8 years, the area would see a large influx of families. The population in Morgan County, which had been right around 60,000 at the 1960 census, had jumped nearly 30% by 1970. With a population upwards of 77,000 people. However, while we associate this time period with the tumultuous news unfolding in the background, the Vietnam War and the Richard Nixon presidency come to mind. Much smaller stories were unfolding in the background of this quiet Alabama county. By the time that next census would take place in 1970, 3 families in Morgan County were forever changed. And when the census took place, 3 women would be missing from the area's population. This is the story of Mary Faye Hunter, Juanita Acker, and Joyce Drake. Welcome to Unresolved. I am your host, Michael Whelan, and this story is a bit different from my usual fare. While I normally try to pick stories that are a bit out of the mainstream, this episode is almost on an entirely different level. This episode contains 3 stories, and all of which are noticeably different from one another, but are linked together by a time and place, and all have proven to be pretty difficult for me to research. Outside of a couple of news reports from about a decade ago, these stories have not been updated since they happened in the 1960s. Before I get to the episode though, I just want to tell you a couple of ways how you can support the podcast and help keep it a regular show moving forward. If you ever get the chance to rate and review the podcast positively on iTunes, that would be greatly appreciated. And if you feel like taking your support a step further, you could head to patreon.com/unresolvedpod to help financially support the podcast. Patreon supporters are now able to listen to exclusive mini-episodes, the first of which, about the mysterious O'Hare incident, is available to listen right now. So if you're interested and able to support the podcast, please go check that out. If not, then your iTunes ratings and reviews are always appreciated, and if you don't feel like it, just keep listening to the podcast. I appreciate that too. Now, without any further ado, let's turn back the dial to half a century ago, and learn a bit more about the women that would become the Morgan County 3. Mary Faye Hunter was born on May 2nd, 1933, in the same town where she would live for her entire life, Decatur, Alabama. In 1951, Mary graduated from Decatur High School and would continue to live with her family over the next decade and a half. Some have theorized that Mary might have had some kind of mental disability that her family tried to keep quiet, and that's why she chose to remain close to home. But I haven't found anything to prove that other than some internet gossip. Regardless, Mary Faye Hunter lived a pretty quiet life. She was never married and did not seem to have much of a romantic history. At least, nothing that anyone spoke about. She worked as a secretary at the nearby Marshall Space Flight Center on the nearby Redstone Arsenal military post, and she held down her job for over a decade. She also volunteered as a piano player for the youth choir at Center Methodist Church, and that was a job she took pretty seriously. Many regarded her as a gentle, quiet soul, which stood in stark contrast with her ominous end in 1967. In May of 1967, America was undergoing some serious growing pains. The Vietnam War was raging overseas, and while men were shipping off to fight in the conflict, others were returning to a world that was less than welcoming. Protests were raging across the nation, and the month before, April, had seen one of the highest profile dissensions, with Muhammad Ali refusing military service. Earlier that year, in February, the first Super Bowl had taken place. The Green Bay Packers had defeated the Kansas City Chiefs 35-10. That same month, the infectious anthem, Respect, by Aretha Franklin, had been recorded and had just been released upon the world in April. On the same musical note, The Doors had just released their debut album, and a guitar phenom named Jimi Hendrix was getting ready to drop his debut album, Are You Experienced, later that summer. But while these legendary pop culture moments were happening and making history, there was a seedier side to the world at large. Albert DeSalvo, named the Boston Strangler, had been convicted in January of that year. Worldwide protests were threatening international relationships, and the Supreme Court had not yet heard the Loving v. Virginia case, meaning that interracial marriage was still prohibited in states such as Alabama. Amidst all of this, the war, the conflict, the music, the moments that would never be forgotten, Mary Faye Hunter was celebrating her 34th birthday in Decatur, Alabama. 4 days later, she would last be seen alive. May 6th, 1967, was described as a rainy Saturday in the town of Decatur, Alabama. Mary Faye Hunter left her family's home, which was on the 800 block of 8th Avenue Southeast, and headed off on foot towards the House of Beauty, a hair salon on Grant Street Southeast. Mary had an appointment there this morning, and she did not want to be late. She did make it there on time, and was able to get her hair styled. She then left the salon at around 11:30 a.m., and headed up another block towards downtown Decatur. Multiple witnesses saw her at an A&P grocery store on Johnston Street just before noon. This would put her a little under a mile away from home, a trip that would take no more than 15 or so minutes even if she was walking. When she failed to return home by 1 p.m., her worried parents reported her missing to police. Family and friends began searching for her that afternoon, but they were unable to find any trace of Mary. Within a day, the search had become a police matter. The family of Mary Faye contacted Jeannie Dixon, a self-proclaimed psychic from the area. In her response, she told the family that Mary was still alive, but had gotten a little quote-unquote mixed up. 5 days after her disappearance, on May 11th, 1967, an article published in the local Alabama Courier displayed a picture of Mary Faye Hunter. The news bulletin underneath stated that there was a $2,000 reward for information that led to Mary's safe return home. It also stated that police had been searching for the young woman in the preceding week, searching mainly in abandoned homes and farm buildings in the hopes of uncovering any clues. They also stated that the search had extended north of Morgan County, to the other side of the Tennessee River, in southern Limestone County. That newspaper article is one of the few mentions I've seen of Mary's story getting any attention in the media, although her story would become a touchy subject of local gossip. Her case would remain a tragic disappearance until later that year. On October 14th, 1967, a woman fishing in the area around Flint Creek, an offshoot of the Tennessee River between Decatur and Hartselle, made a shocking discovery. In the body of water called Wheeler Creek, she discovered the skeletal remains of Mary Faye Hunter. Police and the coroner were called to the scene. Alvin Benn, a legendary journalist who had achieved fame while covering the civil rights movement of the 1960s, lived in the area at the time. In his memoir, called Reporter, he described the scene surrounding the discovery of Mary Faye Hunter's remains, and how the police were very lackadaisical when it came to roping off the scene from the public. He describes the coroner in scuba gear fishing out the bones of a young woman from the water, while members of the public were looking over the scene, pointing out spots where more of her remains had been found. State officials later told a coroner's jury that the young woman had been sexually assaulted before her death, but the investigators declined to say how they had come to this conclusion. After all, the remains were deteriorated to the point of being considered skeletal, and this seemed like an impossible bridge to cross when it came to 1960s forensic testing. To this day, it has been undetermined how investigators reached that conclusion, how the notion of a sexual assault entered the case. Bob Hancock, a state investigator for the Alabama Bureau of Investigation, lived in the area and served as the primary detective for this case. He had to begrudgingly admit, a short time after the remains of Mary Faye Hunter were found, that, quote, "We just had nothing to go on in that case." Investigators were unable to come up with any solid leads or dig up any pieces of evidence in their search to find out what had happened to Mary Faye. By the time her remains were found, and her family found out what her fate had been, her case had already joined the pantheon of Alabama's cold cases. One theory I have been able to come across came not from a newspaper article, nor a news story. It came from the most unlikely of places, a Facebook group dedicated to Decatur, Alabama. It only has a few hundred members, and some of its most recent posts are from a handful of years ago. However, in a random post buried on this Facebook page, one person states that the investigation was called off because the primary suspect in this case died shortly after the mysterious death of Mary Faye Hunter. Obviously, I cannot verify this, and I cannot find any newspaper reports that would validate this gossip, but a Reddit comment made by a web sleuth carries on this theory. This theory, which is spawned from decades-old Decatur gossip, is that Mary Faye Hunter was having an affair with a married man. When she became pregnant, she was taken to a doctor that performed illegal abortions. During the procedure, she began to hemorrhage and died shortly thereafter. From there, her body was disposed of near Highway 67, near the backwaters of the Tennessee River. This is also where the primary suspect, the person that the original Facebook commenter alleges was involved, committed suicide as well. It's just worth noting that all of that is just pure gossip. As far as I know, there's no truth to it. I honestly don't know what to make of that theory. On one hand, I guess it's possible, but I do wish that I did not have to hinge a theory on throwaway Facebook and Reddit comments. However, when it comes to this case, there is really not much else to say. The tragic disappearance and death of Mary Faye Hunter is a story that has not gotten any traction in over 50 years. She's been mentioned in a few newspaper articles in that time span, but Mary Faye's story is oft forgotten, even among the people in this central Alabama town. And unfortunately, she would not be the only woman to meet a mysterious end during this time period. Juanita Acker, born Juanita Holland, entered the world on July 15, 1928. Her family lived near Birmingham, Alabama, in a town called Alexandria, and she would graduate from Alexandria High School in the 1940s. In 1947, she met a young man named Callis Creighton Acker, nicknamed Cal, and the two would marry in 1947. Cal, who was a veteran that had served in the US Navy, had just returned from World War II to finish his BA degree at Tulane University, before marrying Juanita. The couple would go on to have 3 children together, a son named William and 2 daughters named Susan and Kathy. However, instead of just settling down, they continued to grow as a couple and experience new things together. Cal earned his certified public accounting rating in 1956, and Juanita followed that up 2 years later with an accomplishment of her own, joining the United States Women in the Air Force. This had been set up in the latter half of the 1940s to let women participate in the armed forces, and she started off by heading off for basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. This is what eventually brought the family up to Decatur, Alabama, where Juanita worked at Redstone Arsenal, becoming an employee of the Safeguard program in Huntsville, Alabama. Cal established his own accounting firm in Decatur, creating all kinds of business ties with the locals, and integrating this couple into the fabric of Morgan County. Tragedy struck in the mid-1960s, when Cal was diagnosed with cancer. He would pass away in January of 1966, leaving behind 3 children, and making Juanita a 37-year-old widow. Over the next couple of years, Juanita and her 3 children would struggle to recover from this tragic loss, and would keep trying to move forward. However, they would suffer through another tragic loss when their family home, on Decatur's Buena Vista Circle, burned down in April of 1969. The loss of this home meant that Juanita would have to temporarily move into a hotel along US Route 31, while she looked for a more permanent living situation. After the loss of the family home on April 29, 1969, Juanita and her 2 daughters, 16-year-old Susan and 12-year-old Kathy, moved into a motel. Her teenage son, William, went to live with friends for the time being. On Friday, May 23, 1969, both of Juanita's daughters left for the evening. 16-year-old Susan went out on a date with her 21-year-old fiancé, Nathan, while 12-year-old Kathy went to go spend the night at a friend's house. Juanita left a motel key beneath the doormat so that Susan would be able to come back after her date with Nathan. It was essentially a backup key so that neither of the daughters would get locked out. A motel employee, who started his shift at about 11 p.m., stated that the phone line from Juanita Acker's room was connected when he clocked in. Again, this was around 11 o'clock that night, and he later told police that the phone was connected for about 7 minutes or so. A couple of hours later, sometime after 1 a.m., Juanita's teenage daughter, Susan, returned to the motel room. Her fiancé, Nathan, was still with her, and they were planning to slip into the motel room in the early morning hours of May 24th. As they approached, they saw that the key, which Juanita usually left under the doormat, was found on top of the mat. When they entered the motel room, they found 40-year-old Juanita Acker lying in a blood-soaked bed. Investigators stated that she had been shot twice in the face with a .22 caliber pistol, leaving behind a troubling crime scene. Police stated that nothing from the room was missing, and there seemed to be no sign of burglary. Morgan County Sheriff David Sandlin stated, quote, "I think somebody slipped in while she was sleeping and shot her." Police questioned both Juanita's 16-year-old daughter, Susan, as well as her older fiancé, Nathan Harton. They also asked around the motel, looking for anyone that knew anything about what had happened that evening. This is when they discovered that her phone was in use at sometime around 11 p.m., according to the motel employee that started work at around that time. They also discovered that a family friend had come to visit Juanita at around 10 p.m., but no details of that were ever publicly released. Toxicologists determined that Acker's time of death had been at around 11:30 p.m., based off of the evidence and the clues pointing in that direction. It comes as a surprise then that nobody heard the gunshots, or at least nobody reported the gunshots. State investigator Bob Hancock, who had led the investigation into Mary Faye Hunter's suspicious death, also helped out with this one. He remained active in the investigation, and helped coordinate investigative efforts between state and local authorities. One of the investigators involved in the case, Clarence Harris, was told that Juanita Acker was set to remarry in August of that year to a man named Bill Givens, who lived in the Chicago area. I cannot tell you whether this mysterious fiancé was questioned about his whereabouts or what his romantic history with Juanita was like, but I can only assume that police were able to speak to him. Juanita Holland Acker was laid to rest at the Roselawn Gardens of Memory in Decatur, right next to her husband, Cal. Together, they have been waiting for answers for almost 50 years. As the 1960s came to an end in the United States, a dark cloud seemed to emerge over the American zeitgeist. The 1960s had brought with them hope and change, but as the decade came to an end, many weren't sure whether it was the change they wanted. The Vietnam War seemed to have no end in sight, and in December of 1969, a draft lottery had taken place to conscript young men for the armed conflict. The Beatles, who had taken America by storm just a few years beforehand, were on the brink of breaking up for good. The murder of Sharon Tate, orchestrated by Charles Manson, had consumed the American media, and many credit that incident for metaphorically representing a new chapter in American history. In the area of Morgan County, this time period was represented by another series of events, the Apollo missions. Redstone Arsenal, which was the US Missile Command, oversaw a large part of the rocket programs that were worked into the United States' space program, and this was represented in the area's population, which continued to trend upwards. But as the 1960s paved the way for the 1970s, another event was unfolding in the background of a quiet area in Morgan County, Alabama. Thelma Joyce Sanders was born on May 12, 1949. Growing up, she preferred to go by her middle name, Joyce. In 1967, she graduated from her hometown's Falkville High, just 25 or so miles south of Decatur. While in high school, Joyce had become smitten with a varsity football player named Randy Drake. The two married shortly after Joyce's graduation, and they would welcome 2 children into the world over the next few years. Stephen, their oldest son, and Randall Jr., the second-born. Joyce Drake, taking on her husband's surname, became a stay-at-home mom, while Randy supported the family by working at a service station in the nearby town of Coleman. In her free time, Joyce helped out with her parents, who owned and managed a general store in the Coal Springs community of Eva, another small town about 10 miles away from Falkville. The store, called R.L. Sanders Grocery, was named after her father, and was located along Eva-Falkville Road. The 2 children, 2-year-old Stephen and 9-month-old Randall, were at home with their father on the Wednesday morning of January 7th, 1970. 20-year-old Joyce went to help out with her parents at their store, and left early that morning to help pitch in. At around 10:30 a.m., Joyce departed from R.L. Sanders Grocery, leaving with roughly $400 in checks, which had been used to pay for groceries and other goods. She was heading to the bank to cash the checks and then bring the money back to the store. By all indications, she was alone during this time period. Some reports indicate that Joyce stopped by her sister-in-law's home, another young woman named Betty Sanders who lived along the way, but there's been no confirmation of that in the years since. Joyce did make it to the bank a short while later, cashing the checks and putting the cash into a small money bag, which she carried under her arm out of the bank. Nobody in the bank saw her with anybody, but at least 3 witnesses saw her leaving the bank. These witnesses say that there was a man with her in the cab of her pickup truck after leaving the bank. Multiple newspaper reports would state that this man was red-headed, and at least a few would state that witnesses described him as quote-unquote large. One newspaper not so delicately described him as quote-unquote big-built. We know this because when Joyce failed to return to her parents' store that afternoon, they became incredibly concerned. Likewise, she had also not returned home, and family and friends began to look for her. Within hours, police were called, and the search started to find Joyce Drake. In the late afternoon of Wednesday, January 7th, 1970, townsfolk banded together to begin looking for Joyce and her pickup truck. Early that afternoon, after the sun had set, Joyce's truck was found along Union Hill Church Road, a small little two-lane expressway surrounded by woods. There was no trace of Joyce in the truck, nor of a mysterious red-haired man, or any of the money she had gotten from the bank. They would later find the money bag, which had been emptied, save for a leftover handwritten check and a single penny, on a rural road near Coal Springs. However, by the time they found the money bag the following day, they had determined what had happened to 20-year-old Joyce. Throughout the night of January 7th, a group of 3 men, including a city council member, were searching for Joyce in the area east of Falkville, named Odin Ridge. The weather, which had been snowy for some time, made the search miserable and almost unbearable, but the men persevered, hopeful that their flashlights would be able to uncover any trace of the young mother. At a little after 9 p.m., they stumbled down a snowy road east of Falkville. There, they discovered Joyce Drake, or at least what remained of her. Her body, which had been left in the snow on top of a small trash pile, had been dead for several hours. She was described as being quote-unquote mutilated by some local reporters, with her throat slashed at least 4 times. John McBride, the former coroner and sheriff of Morgan County, described the crime as being one of the most brutal murders in Morgan County history. He also stated that Joyce Drake had been the victim of, quote, a vicious, mad killer, unquote. Some newspaper reports indicated that Joyce's hands had been left clutching tiny red hairs, and that there was apparent evidence of skin underneath her fingernails, both of which indicated quite a struggle had taken place. Detectives, aided in their hunt once again by state investigator Bob Hancock, stated that there had been no sign of a sexual assault, and that the motive for the crime had most likely been robbery. As the investigation tried to narrow in on the man responsible, police began to scour the area for anyone matching the description. A young man with red hair who might have been larger in size or stature. A student at nearby Eva High School, named Stanley Hall, came forward and told investigators that on the day in question, January 7th, 1970, he had picked up a hitchhiker that matched the description of this man. He stated that this red-haired young man, who looked to be in his late 20s or early 30s, stood around 5'11" and weighed around 160 pounds. Stanley had also apparently picked him up not too far away from where Joyce's truck had been found, along Union Hill Church Road. Despite this news, however, the investigation would struggle to make any real progress over the coming months. Within days, the investigation had seemed poised to file charges at any given moment. Morgan County Sheriff Van Ward, when asked if they had any leads for the investigation to find Joyce Drake's killer, stated, quote, I believe he's still in the area. A headline in the local Decatur daily newspaper stated, quote, Drake murder arrest near. The article itself quoted authorities from Morgan County who believed that this suspect, a young man who matched the description and was on their radar, was known to the Drake and Sanders family. The Athens News-Courier, another local paper, reiterated this thought in a story they published just 6 days after the murder, on January 13th. Quote, those close to the investigation have agreed that the murder possibly was done by someone who knew the victim, but not as well as he thought. This became a common theme in almost all of the reporting of the investigation into the murder of Joyce Drake, the belief that her killer had been previously known to her and her family. A little over 2 months after her murder, in fact, multiple papers reported that a Morgan County grand jury was nearing a decision to indict a man for the crime. This story, published on March 10th, 1970, referred to this young man as the quote-unquote prime suspect, and made it quite clear that first-degree murder charges were expected in this pending trial. These reports state that this man had been originally held by police for misdemeanor charges before jumping bond and running off to a northeastern state. From there, he was apparently recaptured and detained by police, and then returned to a Madison County jail in Huntsville, Alabama. All of these newspaper reports reiterated that he was quote-unquote known to the family. This person of interest was never publicly named because those charges and indictments never came. Later statements by investigators seemed to indicate that this suspect passed a polygraph, and apparently had an airtight alibi that investigators could not look past. 1 year after the murder of Joyce Drake, the Coleman Times ran a front-page article remembering Joyce and revisiting her case, which still remained unsolved. R.L. Sanders, the father of Joyce, was quoted multiple times in the article. Quote, "I think Joyce knew the person who killed her. I also believe he is still living in the area. I believe this because shortly after the murder, I found a blood-stained dollar bill in my cash register which someone had used to buy something. Also, a bill was found at a Hartzell supermarket and another in Falkville." He also shared a thought that I'm sure any parent could sympathize with in his shoes. Quote, "I am afraid to say what I would do if I knew for sure who killed Joyce." Both Joyce's mother and her widower husband, Randy, expressed more reserved emotions when asked about how they would react if they came face to face with her killer. Randy, Joyce's young husband, stated, quote, "Nothing is gained when a person takes the law into his own hands." Joyce's mother, Mrs. R.L. Sanders, seemed to reiterate this line of thinking. Quote, "It would be hard to forgive him, but I would definitely want the person punished to the full extent of the law." In the same newspaper article, investigator Bob Hancock is quoted as saying, quote, "We are still working on the case. We will never stop investigating the Joyce Drake murder until an arrest is made." Over the years, the investigation into determining who is responsible for Joyce Drake's murder has had many starts and stops. On the 2-year anniversary of the crime, investigators told reporters that they had a list of good suspects, including a local man that had moved out of state shortly after the crime took place. However, like the first major suspect, it was later determined that this man had a rock-solid alibi. He had not been in Alabama at the time that Joyce Drake was killed. Morgan County Sheriff Van Ward told reporters, quote, "We thought several times that we had him, and then it didn't pan out. I know one time both Harry, investigator Harry Perry, and Bob Hancock came in here, and they just knew they had it solved." Over the next few decades, the investigation to find out who had killed Joyce Drake joined the mysterious death of Mary Faye Hunter and the unsolved shooting of Juanita Acker. All three were young women who died tragically and suspiciously in a 4-year period. And all three would experience a significant calamity when their case files, containing the precious case notes and evidence, went missing. Morgan County Chief Deputy Mike Corley has gone on the record to state that he is not sure who lost the documents and the evidence. But it could have happened when they were in the custody of either local, county, or state investigators, all of whom were working in cooperation on the 3 separate investigations. Because of this, the loss of their 3 case files, they have become forever linked, as 3 women of a tragic coincidence who are unlikely to ever find resolution in the afterlife.
She was a young mother of 2 just beginning her life.
But almost 40 years ago, someone killed her and left her in the snow along a rural Morgan County road. Tonight, someone wants us to take another look at this cold case mystery.
WHNT News 19's Carson Clark joins us now with this special report. And Carson, we don't know who sent us the letter.
That's right, Elise. A few months ago, we received this letter in the mail There was no name attached. They wrote asking us to look into the murder of Joyce Drake from 1970. The person also included this stack of newspaper articles about the case. So tonight, WHNT News 19 is shining new light on this cold case, murder in the snow. January 7th, 1970. The new year and the new decade were just a week old. 4 men had recently walked on the moon. The future looked bright. But there was an icy chill in the air that was about to settle across one Morgan County community that still sends shivers up people's spines.
We couldn't believe it happened here, you know, in Morgan County. To have back then, you know, it just didn't happen.
What happened on that snowy January day is still a mystery. The body of a 20-year-old mother of 2 turned up on the side of a rural county road lying in the snow. Someone had stabbed her to death. Weeks following, newspapers were filled with the chilling details of her brutal murder.
People were afraid because we didn't really know why, and we didn't know. We knew the person was still out there that had killed her, and he might kill again.
Joyce Sanders Drake graduated from Falkville High School in 1967. Her classmate, Pam Bryant Owens, remembers her friend and her loving personality.
Always joking, had a lot of friends. She was a pretty girl. She had blonde hair.
The story of that young blonde girl's murder begins here at this old building in the Cold Springs community. Her parents ran a store here, and Joyce, as she often did, jumped in her father's old Chevy, took off down the road alone.
And she was evidently taking money to the bank at the time.
Joyce made it here to the bank in Falkville and cashed $400 worth of checks. But something happened on her way home. Somewhere between the bank and her parents' store, someone else got in that truck.
I think everybody else was about the same way how this could happen, apparently in daylight.
Former Morgan County Sheriff Buford Burgess worked Joyce's case. During his 10 years in office, he never came up with answers to questions like who got in the truck and why did Joyce pick him up.
I don't think they ever even had a lead. I don't think there was ever a suspect that we knew of.
Someone spotted Joyce driving back past her parents' store that day with a red-headed man in the seat beside her. That was the last time she was seen alive. A search began, and a few hours later, someone spotted the truck here on Union Hill Church Road, but no sign of Joyce. Then at 9 p.m., almost 12 hours after she left, men searching the area found her mutilated body here on the side of Lawrence Cove Road, lying in the snow.
We heard that there was red hair in her hands, and she did have skin under her fingernails, so evidently there was a struggle.
Investigators at the time indicated Joyce Drake fought hard against her attacker, but it was no use. She wasn't sexually assaulted, but the money she picked up at the bank was gone. County and state investigators worked hour after hour trying to find out who killed Joyce Drake. 2 months later, this headline in the Decatur Daily declared an arrest was near. The story quotes an investigator as saying, "We feel real progress has been made and that a solution to the case will be reached soon." And the story also says this, quote, "I can't comment on this much, but I suspect it will be someone known to the family," end quote. That was March of 1970. Investigators never made that arrest.
Every day I need would get tip on something and would follow it up. We followed it vigorously, we really did, because that's one of the few cases that hadn't been solved.
There were no DNA tests in 1970, and we don't know who investigators came close to arresting. For 4 decades now, someone has gotten away with murder.
We felt like victims too, because we loved her and we wanted justice. We wanted to know who did that and to why. We wanted, the questions why. And, what was the motive, what really happened that day.
As much as this murder gripped the community, the county, and North Alabama, time eventually marched on, and interest in this murder in the snow melted away, with only those who loved her remembering this young mother's lost battle for justice. Now, while no arrest was ever made, investigators did come to some conclusions. They believe Joyce Drake's attacker was a local because he seemed to know the roads very well, and he also had knowledge that Joyce made frequent trips to the bank. Also, they believe Joyce recognized her attacker because she would never pick up someone she didn't know. And Jerry and Elise, if Joyce Drake were still alive, she would be celebrating her 60th birthday on May 12th.
So what about her family?
Well, we're not sure what happened to the husband or her 2 sons. Her parents are deceased, but we found one brother, and the family declined to participate in our story.
Carson, you got to believe that somebody out there knows something.
You almost have to believe that because it was a local person, and usually, people will talk about things like that. So somebody probably knows what happened.
Case not closed, I guess.
It's not. Still open.
All right, thanks,
Carson, thanks.
What you just heard was a 2009 news report from WHNT 19, a CBS affiliate operated out of Huntsville, Alabama. That news report is the only news coverage I can find of Joyce's murder, and it happens to be a clip from almost a decade ago. Thankfully, it seemed to kick off a very brief resurgence of the case, which brought forth some new information at the very least. Police would announce a $25,000 reward for any information that led to some resolution in the Drake murder. They also began to open up and answer questions about the case, as well as the unsolved cases of Mary Faye Hunter and Juanita Acker. They stated that they were not looking into the 3 unsolved deaths as being linked necessarily, but they had always considered the possibility of a link between Hunter and Acker. After all, the cause and manner of Mary Faye Hunter's death could never be determined, and both her and Juanita Acker had worked at Redstone Arsenal at the time they died. Mike Corley, the chief deputy of Morgan County, has stated about the cases, quote, "I wouldn't say the cases are cold because every time we reach out, we receive some new information." In 2011, the Decatur Daily published an article about the 3 women, which quoted state investigator Bob Hancock. Despite retiring from the Alabama Bureau of Investigation in 1988, he had continued to work on the cases in his free time, and he had carried on by accumulating some of his leads. Hancock had been the lead investigator in the Mary Faye Hunter disappearance and death in 1967, and assisted the main detectives in both Acker and Drake's murders. When the Decatur Daily article was published in 2011, he was the last of these original detectives still living, and one of the very few people in the area who had first-hand knowledge of the 3 cases. He stated that he had continued to work on the cases and developed new leads, which he had then passed on to Morgan County investigators. He refused to say how many people he suspected were involved in these separate crimes, but he also reiterated his belief that the first 2 cases, that of Mary Faye Hunter and Juanita Acker, may have been linked. His long-running theory was that Acker had some knowledge of Hunter's disappearance and death, and that is why she was actually killed. I could not tell you how he came upon this information, but I can only hope that he had a good reason to say so. He did say in this Decatur Daily article that police never had, quote, a really good suspect in the 1969 shooting of Acker, but he did say that he spoke to a coworker of hers in the 1960s who he was always interested in. This coworker passed a polygraph test in the initial investigation, which seemed to put him to rest as a person of interest. But Hancock's suspicion had always been piqued. Hancock continued to forward information, hoping that it would lead to some resolution for these 3 women. As he told investigators in 2011, quote, "I believe the cases can be solved. I never gave up on solving these cases. We will. The families deserve justice." If we look back at these crimes as being a part of a single killer's spree, we're likely to be disappointed. The only 3 reasons that these 3 women are linked together is because of their geographical location, the time period in which they went missing, and that their 3 case files disappeared. It's possible, if not likely, that these 3 women were killed by different people with different motives. However, if we take a step back and look at them as being part of a larger framework, we can see that these 3 women were a part of an area experiencing a violent few years. In 1968, wedged between the death of Mary Faye Hunter and the murder of Juanita Acker, a 68-year-old man named Aubrey Boyd was found dead in his home. A window had been broken, and Boyd appeared to have been hit in the head multiple times by an unknown attacker. After he failed to make contact with friends or family for over a week, police were called, and they found his decomposed remains in his home. Authorities stated that robbery was not a motive, as over $4,000 was found in Boyd's home, but Boyd's murder remained unsolved. Months after the disappearance of Joyce Drake, in August of 1970, a 29-year-old man named Charles Ray Lovett disappeared from his home in Decatur, Alabama. Police initially believed that Lovett's disappearance was linked to an upcoming grand larceny trial he was testifying in. Despite his body never being found, 2 men were later convicted of his kidnapping. Then, a year later, in August of 1971, a young man named David Smart disappeared. Smart was an engineer at Redstone Arsenal, whose body was found a month after he went missing, near Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge. He had been shot to death, after being shot once in the head. In December of 1973, a service station operator named Morris K. Edmondson in Priceville, Alabama, was shot to death while working. Police later theorized that he was a victim of a multi-state robbery spree, which stretched into Georgia in the following weeks. In April of 1975, a man named Earl James was stabbed multiple times in his Cedar Lake Road home in Decatur. This took place just a short distance away from where Mary Faye Hunter's remains had been found, in Wheeler Lake, and where Juanita Acker had been shot to death off of Highway 31. The Morgan County coroner called the crime scene, at the home of Earl James, one of the most brutal murders he had ever seen. Investigators stated it was a personal killing, believing that the person who perpetrated it wanted him dead, ignoring the money found in James's own pocket. Then, in January of 1976, a man named John Wesley Hudson was shot in the back, north of Cortland, near the Tennessee River. Hudson's body was found by 2 duck hunters, just 15 or so feet away from his open car door. It was believed that the person who committed this crime had been chasing Hudson, as he was shot from behind, in his back and in his arm, and it appeared he had been running out of his car towards the nearby tree line. Police claimed that they knew who committed this last crime, but they did not have enough evidence to officially file any charges. So, why am I telling you all of this? These are all separate crimes which appear to have very little in common with the 3 stories I detailed earlier in this episode. Well, I've gone through tons of newspaper clippings from the area in the hopes that a smoking gun would emerge. These are all violent crimes from Morgan County or the surrounding area, in which police believed a link may be established to one of the other 3 unsolved cases. However, in almost all of these crimes, there was something that set them apart from the others. Some were later solved, and some remain open to this day. Some of those may even be featured on a future episode of Unresolved. However, none of them seem to have any link to the 3 women I am identifying as the Morgan County 3. Other than being violent crimes that took place in the surrounding area within the same time period. There is only one crime that I believe may be linked to the other 3 unsolved killings, and it's a story that has not been written about in over 50 years. Annie D. Dearman, born Annie D. Wilkerson, lived in a town called Moulton, Alabama, roughly 20 miles away from Decatur, in southwestern Morgan County. Local legend states that Annie had been married once in her youth to a man with the last name Moody, but after his return from World War II as a changed man, she divorced him. She quickly remarried to a man from Decatur named Virgil Dearman, taking on his surname. She had 2 children with each of her husbands. On the evening of October 6, 1967, a little over a week before the remains of Mary Faye Hunter would be found in an offshoot of the Tennessee River, Annie Dearman would be shot multiple times in the front yard of her home in Moulton, Alabama. I cannot find any newspaper articles or news coverage of this incident, but local legend states that Annie was shot 5 times in total with a .38 pistol. Local ghost stories allege that Annie had been standing between 2 cars at the time of the shooting, and, after being shot, crawled up to her front porch where she died before she could get any help. Annie Dearman's murder remains unsolved, but police believe that they found their suspect early on in the investigation. Annie's nephew, a young man named Dwight Hindle Shelton, was charged with the murder in December of 1967, before being acquitted in the first half of 1968. Nobody else was ever charged or accused of her murder, and some ghost stories have alleged that Annie D continues to haunt the area, popping up at the time of her murder, which was around midnight. Of all the violent crimes to plague the area in this time period, the shooting death of Annie D. Wilkerson Dearman is the only one I believe could be related. And even that, in my opinion, is a bit of a stretch, as the weapons used in her murder and the shooting of Juanita Acker, a .38 and a .22 respectively, differ. Annie Dearman's murder has become a local ghost story, but that does not change the fact that her murder remains unsolved. There are a countless number of theories or tall tales I could dive into when it comes to these 3 unsolved murders, but that is a debate best left for a message board. If you visit any of the websites that are set up to discuss these murders, just a warning, there are not many, you'll see that the locals who have lived in the area for their entire lives have their own idea on who committed these crimes. Some believe that all 3 are linked, while others believe that someone they know is responsible for at least one of the crimes. Mary Faye Hunter, a 34-year-old Decatur resident who worked as a secretary at Redstone Arsenal and played the piano at her Methodist church, was single at the time of her disappearance in 1967. When her remains were found in October of that year, police failed to identify any suspects or file any charges. Juanita Acker, formerly Juanita Holland, was almost 41 years old and lived in a Decatur motel at the time of her 1969 shooting death. She was survived by 3 children, and despite her shooting death sparking concern throughout the area, no suspects or leads were ever developed. Joyce Drake, formerly Thelma Joyce Sanders, was a 20-year-old mother of 2 who had gone missing in the early afternoon of January 7, 1970. Her remains were found later that evening, and police identified their suspect as a large-built, red-headed man in his late 20s. Police in the area have long suspected relatives of Joyce, including a distant cousin who lived in the vicinity with red hair, but nobody has been officially charged or indicted in her murder. A $25,000 reward for any information still stands. Anyone with information should contact either the Decatur Police Department at 256-341-4635 or the Morgan County Sheriff's Department at 256-301-1174. As of this episode's recording, the stories of Mary Faye Hunter, Juanita Acker, and Joyce Drake remain unresolved. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. If you would like to keep in touch with me or the podcast, you could do so in a variety of ways. Your emails can be sent in to either theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com or to me personally at michael@unresolved.me. And my name is spelled Micheal at unresolved.me. If you use social media and want to follow along with the podcast, you can look up @unresolvedpod to find it on Facebook, Twitter, and now Instagram. I haven't been posting as nearly as much as I should, but I'm in the middle of streamlining, my whole recording and editing process, so hopefully I'll be having a lot more free time to participate in that kind of stuff moving forward. There's also a Facebook discussion group where you could join in and talk about some various true crime cases and mystery stories and stuff like that. It's pretty fun. If you would like to send in a text message or a voicemail, you can use the phone number 831-200-3550. And if you would like to check out the website to find, transcripts of each episode or links to sources or anything else related to the podcast, really, you could find it at unresolved.me. Once again, that's unresolved.me. Also, make sure to check out and subscribe to my other podcast, Hoax, which features a similar style of storytelling, but is focused more on stories of deceptions and frauds and the people that are involved in them. It's pretty interesting. I think you might like it. Anyhow, that's it for me this week. Until next time, everyone, stay safe, and I'll talk to you later.